Hey, what's up? Silas here. I'm going to be discussing a response that I had to a response to a video that I made called Does the Artist Make the Art? Gatekeeping Western Art. So if you haven't seen that video, you should check it out. I'll just give a quick summary. It was about an exchange on the internet about two people who were supposedly defined as males' rights activists or people who are pro-males' rights, Western males in that kind of sense. And they were discussing the sculpture of this white-looking woman, and it turns out it was made by a sculptor, Luo Li Dong, who is a Chinese woman. You should check it out. There's a lot more that actually goes into the discussion of that, and I was just talking about who gatekeeps art. What makes that art? Is that actually an example of Western art? Who is right, who is wrong in this kind of situation? And when I post videos on YouTube, on my channel there, I normally leave some comment. I normally leave a pinned comment at the bottom. And it's normally a multiple choice comment. I've been doing that recently, or just a question for people in general to kind of give a suggestion for what direction the comments can go to. And occasionally people take me up on it and actually respond to it. And I have a regular viewer who's been commenting a lot, and I definitely appreciate it a lot. And they actually addressed every single one of the points. And they've done this before, which again, much appreciated. So I tried to respond to their response in one comment, and it turned out to be longer. And I was like, hey, why don't I share these with you? Because I've gotten a lot of value from comment sections. Even before I was ever making any content that anyone thought was worth commenting on, I've been finding value out of it. And having these comments in these sections, now that I've actually been making content, now that I have some people who are engaged, had some good conversations, decided to go in there. So, as I mentioned, if you haven't watched the video, please check out that video first. But here is the question that I had after the video in the comment section. Is the La Mélodie Oubliée sculpture an example of Western art? The general format of this multiple choice is one troll answer, then one of each taking either side of the answer, then one just speculative, and then I leave E open. A was, yes, the subject is a glorious white Western female. B was, no, only Westerners can create Western art. C, art is a style. Anyone can create any sort of art if they learn how to. D, doesn't really matter, it's a fantastic piece. She's amazingly talented. E, I normally leave that blank, and that's blank. That's normally a prompt for people to answer however they want if they don't want to take one of the points that I post. Now getting into the reading of the comment, he opened up by restating the general question that I had in the video, which was, is La Mélodie Oubliée sculpture an example of Western art? I might paraphrase this for more legibility, but there's going to be a link below to the blog post where you can find it as it was written. Sometimes there's autocorrect. I don't like leaving comments and typing there and then doing the editing. I like leaving as is and then adjusting after the comments. But here we go. Modern Western art, as in the style informed by where the style developed it. I don't look at an African mask made by a wigger and say, hey, look, European art. So honestly, it actually differs from Western style in a few ways. The posture is not consistent, a weak face is rare, and the chest doesn't look natural or innocent. So now on to his response for B, which as I mentioned, B was, now only Westerners can create Western art. This was the response. It's more like only they did. Other people created other things. One can create artworks, but no one creates art. All reimagine it. We stand on the shoulders of giants. In this, that statue was very much the creation of the West, as was the artist. This may be pedantic, but it's typically an unsaid understanding. Now, C was, art is a style. Anyone can create any sort of art if they learn to, and this was his response. The reason I don't pick C is because not everyone can do that. Some types of art require far more mastery and talent than others. Furthermore, I don't know much about African art. I'm guessing certain colors or materials have or had some significance. If I made an African mask, I could make it look similar, but miss the concept of value behind it. Now E, the title of your video is very interesting. Should we disallow others to appropriate our culture? If you think it's a good one, sure. The issue in this aspect is, let's say a ton of Asians or whatever come over and make a ton of art, make a lot of art, and they do so with some different set of guidelines, and then they say, that is the way to make Western arts. Yikes, that's a thing in the West. So I think he touched on different topics here, and you'll see in my response. I like what he said on this, touching on different things. That has some things that I've thought of. There's something in a video that I had thought of for some time. Back in 2017, I was in a gallery and I recorded something, and I'm going to make a separate video about this. I recorded something and it gave me a thought about something that actually came up in this video and has come up in his actual comment and response. And part of what I really enjoy in the comments here, as I've mentioned before, is seeing something like this, where I can post a video like this and like, oh wow, I had this thought some time back from these different circumstances, and here this person commenting from their different circumstances kind of has the same thought. Or we have a situation where I come to this one thing and like, oh, we're talking about the same topic, the same information, but then we have these different ways of looking at it, and it's just encouraging. It's something I enjoy. So let me get into my response. I have seen her art characterized more as contemporary sculpture. I realize the two males commenting may also have been speaking about Western males fighting for the idealized Western female rather than the health at any size, head shaved, pierced, tattooed feminist character that some say is being pushed. Now, this is a little aside. I didn't have this in the comment that I posted on the comment section, but hey, making this video so we can add things, it's something that I thought of also. When he was talking about the appearance, saying that the weak face is rare and the chest doesn't look natural or innocent, I would say I would push back on that a bit. I think there's different styles. I mean, sure it's not the strong chin kind of Statue of Liberty type thing, but you look at someone like Edward Degas with his series like The Little Dancer and his ballerinas, and they had a more softer face. Sure, they were younger girls, but that's just a different appearance thing. That's an aesthetic thing. And this is a thing of what do people find attractive. I used to have a big thing for like the Suicide Girls alt goth type of look thing with the tattoos and piercings. And now I kind of think, okay, that has different aspects. Like, what's the mentality behind someone that would do that, and where was I meant to when I found that attractive? Would I still find that attractive now? There's different kind of ideals and ideas of what's considered attractive in that sense. As for the chest not being realistic or innocent, I think I've seen fit women with a chest like this. She didn't use a model for what I know with this, but I don't think it's an unrealistic depiction of what a fit female could look like. And when it comes to the innocence, that's again an aesthetic thing. That's depending on how you're looking at it. Yes, there is an effect of lace, and she came in and painted on this lace, even on the bronze sculpture, of kind of a see-through effect of the clothes, and the nipples, I think, a bit more pointed. So it might be more suggestive of imagery than it is in some other works. But hey, you walk around Rome, you walk around these European cities, and there's just naked sculptures going around. You walk into museums, and there's naked sculptures of females and things like that. So I think the appearance of it being naked, that whole thing of innocence, I don't necessarily think that's an aspect of, we can say, Western art has been very innocent in that sense. Okay, now back to the rest of the response. I'm going to jump out if I add things, bear with me. So we're jumping back in on kind of a geographical type of discussion here. So would African art be only sub-Saharan, or does that also count North African? Because when you come to North African, they're mostly Arabic, the people. And now, if you say this is Arabic art versus African art, then would the Middle Eastern art count as it? Like things that are done in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Persia, and that kind of area? Would you say that's Middle Eastern art? Then now, when do you transition over to European continent or the greater Asian continent? Now you go to like Hindu art, you go into the old art of the Han Dynasty of the Chinese, you go all the way to Japan, you go to Korea, now you start going to Turkey, you start going to the Slavic countries, you start going to Western Europe. When do those transition over from one or the other? So I think the term Western art is a lot more nebulous than something like Impressionist art. Now, Impressionist art is characterized by the small brushstrokes. You can think of people like Monet. Monet has, to me, one of my favorite paintings I've ever seen, which is the woman with a parasol, which is just a woman kind of standing on top of a hillock or a grassy hill. You're kind of looking up at her, and there's a kid in the back, but she's holding this parasol. And this effect of light and wind and atmosphere, this open, also the open kind of layouts of the paintings of what they chose to depict was part of the impressionism. And you actually go up and you look at the painting and you can see there's parts where he chose to have the canvas come out and be seen, and it's just something, it's an amazing feeling just being in the presence of that kind of creation, that kind of art. Well, anyway, so saying something like Western art is definitely more nebulous than something like Impressionist art. Because when it comes down to it, if you're using those small brushstrokes, if you're using those open kind of panoramic kind of views, that would be considered impressionist, an impressionist style. You don't have to necessarily be alive in that location at that time for it to be impressionist, even though that's the name that kind of came out to define what was done by a select group of people in a select place at a select time. But now that has been established, you can still do things in that style. Now, as for the ability, that is assumed, and I put that in there, and I think he also addressed that somehow. You have to think, yeah, this has to be someone who's actually able to do this actual thing. Like, for example, if you're a sculptor, you need the basic, like, hands or fingers and things like that. I know there are prosthetics to do it, but anyway, you'd need the ability to access those prosthetics if possible. So, if there are prosthetics that are good enough for you to actually sculpt in a way, and you were living in the middle of the countryside somewhere, you'd still need to be able to have access to those prosthetics before even able to learn the techniques and ability to actually create that actual piece. And for example, I can sculpt with clay. I've done that before. I've done stuff with wax and things like that. I've done different kinds of actual physical, in real life, like analog kind of sculpting. I've also done digital 3D sculpting. But with either of these things, you still need access to the actual tools. But once you have that, then you can learn the ability to do it. Technically, I could actually get access to the actual marble that Michelangelo used for the David, and I could technically possibly learn enough to do some kind of thing. And that's where I kind of thought of, yeah, the good example is forgeries and restorations. These things can be done by people by non-Western stock and be indistinguishable in the actual look and form from what the original artist did. You see this already to an extent in the culinary arts, and not the stereotypical you go to New York and no matter what ethnic restaurant you go to, it's being cooked by Mexicans. But you yourself, if you cook Italian, it's Italian. And would that now be considered Western? Now we're talking about things like digital, like the computer. You're doing a 3D model, and now you have 3D printers and things like that. Now let's say you got to some kind of future point where you can actually get the marble that was originally used for this piece, somehow grind it down to its constituents, to its powder state, put it in some kind of 3D printer, and then scan the actual pieta, and then have that 3D printer use that dust to actually recreate almost atom to atom the actual pieta. Would that be considered Western art? So think about some time in history, before there was a West, before people had the idea of what the West was, and it was still nation states and things like that. There were probably some German people who had seen some painter and were like, hey, we shouldn't let those French people come over here and paint like our German people are doing, whatever tribes they had at that time, like the Gauls and I don't know. They have that kind of situation. So they had some sort of ownership over that. Yet now that we look at the West as Western Europe in that sense, somebody who's never even been to Europe can say, oh, that is part of Western art. Whereas there's a time, probably even when that art was actually being made, where if you showed somebody who was a contemporary of that artist, that person would say, no, this is German art, and somebody else would say, no, that is French art, and not really allow that whole situation to be like, oh, you guys are just making the same kind of Western art. So Luo Lidong did study in a Beijing university first. She may have been taught by entirely Western European teachers or focused strictly on techniques that were developed in Western Europe. Most of my official artistic schooling was in the United States of America and in Europe. Will the art I make still be considered African because I happen to have been born to parents of the Luya tribe that were born and raised in Western Kenya? Does my having been born in Paris trump that and then go back now to saying, oh, because you were born there, that's where you first had your experience with art? And I remember having memories of going to the Louvre. I think I have memories of going to Versailles. There's actually photos of Versailles. So I've seen art and have been inspired by it at a very young age, at a formative age, somewhat formative, beginning of the formative years. So do you consider that to be who I am as an artist? A good example here is something like English literature. I think people understand if you study English literature, you're studying literature that's been written in English. Sure, someone like Shakespeare is a great example of it, and he was English, he was British, he was living there at that time. But anything written in the English language falls under English literature. Now, how about translations? Some of you might say, oh, it might. But let's say you translated the Quran into English, if somebody allowed you to do that. I think it's not allowed by some people. People want it to be read in Arabic only. But if you translated that, would that be considered English literature? I don't think so. Now, is the Bible English literature, even though it was originally written in Aramaic and some other dead languages? What would you say about that? Anyway, so getting to the end of this, we're going to conclude soon. This is about what ownership of the art does the creator have, let alone any non artist. And I saw a documentary recently about how China, the Chinese government, is actually engaged in a grand program to bring back Chinese art that has been sold over the centuries. They're going to auctioneers and things like that. They're one of the biggest players in the global art auction community and things like that. And this is a small, tiny community. Some of you might not have heard of it, but there's, I think, two or three companies that do like something like 90% of the art sales out there. It's very specialized in this sense for the people who value these things. And the Chinese government has put some value into it, and they're spending billions, I think it was billions of dollars, going out to different private collectors, going out to different museums, and when things come up on auctions, if there's a vase, if there's some other statue, there's some kind of artistic heirloom type things of the Chinese culture, they're trying to buy them back and bring them back to China. Now, different people have different value in art. I know in general, most people don't care about art. The whole starving artist thing isn't just because a lot of people are artists, it's because a lot of people really don't care about paying for art. A lot of these great artists that we think are great now were also struggling when they were alive. Many of them actually got that acclaim after they died. I think there might be an increase in valuation of art, and I do think some art forms are kind of cross the board where you can just show anyone and they can see some kind of value in it. But when you come to something like the African masks and things like this, and this is coming up a lot about sub-Saharan African and just other countries in general saying, oh, we need to repatriate these pieces. We need to get these things back to these people because they own it in some kind of way. So am I supposed to think that some random person walking on the street here who would as soon as chop a 300-year-old African mask down, like a tribal mask down for kindling to burn a pile of refuse that they have, has some higher ownership over that mask than some curator who's spent time and money in finding it and researching its roots and putting out research into it and putting it on display somewhere and putting it in some museum just because of some genetic or geographical happenstance of their births? I will not. I refuse to do that. I think, as I've mentioned, art is the language of life. I think that's something that I'm noticing, and this whole idea that we have these limitations. I do understand the benefits of defining things, and I'm really big on words. I want words to have some kind of meaning. They don't have to mean what they mean. I understand these things change, but I do understand the importance of categorizing things and agreeing that this is this defines this. But there are those borders, there are those lines that are nebulous. They're not as strict as this. Like this is a straight line. Once you cross over to this side and you cross over to this other side, then it's one or the other. It's not that rigid. It's not a strictly mathematical thing. It's not that simple. But with art, it's very subjective in these things. There are some situations where somebody might see something and find great value, and somebody else might see it and find no value. There may be some somewhat objective ways to measure these things, but it is mostly subjective. I think most people would agree. With art, it is mostly subjective. But I value the people who find value in these objects and want to actually preserve the subjects that are displayed and discussed in these different objects and put them out there. And thanks for listening. Thanks for commenting. Like, share, and subscribe. Links to merchandise store. You can check out some of my art there. Till next time, goodbye.